Trust Talks, an InsurTech Insights podcast hosted by ClearSpeed. I'm your host, Daryanani Kwan. We're asking senior insurance leaders for their perspectives on why trust is critical today and for their real top views on what's happening in the industry. Today, we're kicking off with Joey Daryanani, the VP of Specialized Services at CSAA, a role in which he oversees both internal and external insurance operations. Joey has 40 years of experience in P&C insurance and has built his decades-long career at CSAA. Joey, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Danny, thanks for having me.
I want to start with the 40 years you've spent in insurance. You've seen many cycles of change. How have you reinvented yourself?
Yeah, great question. So 1985, fresh out of college, I joined the organization as a frontline claims adjuster and held numerous positions within the claims department, all the way up to this thing called the pandemic in 2020.
Yep.
And at that time, you might recall that innovation was a big buzzword. How do we innovate and what was the challenges we had and all of that? And during the pandemic, we ran an innovation challenge. And the question was, how can we innovate despite this thing called the pandemic? There was an employee that suggested we get into the contact tracing business. And my phone rang. It was our COO, Bob Vallier. And he said, Joey, would you explore this idea? It seems pretty crazy. And frankly, I'm talking to him and I don't even know what contact tracing is. I'm Googling contact tracing.
Yeah.
And I figured out soon after, and I said, this is a possibility. We're good investigators in the claims organization.
Yeah.
We capture notes really well. We know the medical field, and we have the trust of the community. I said, let's go do it. Then the next question was, well, how much do we charge? Well, I have no idea, right? So how about we start at like $23 an hour? And we were using claims folks to go do this so that we don't lay people off.
Yes.
That was just one example. We grew a startup organization within CSAA. It went from 0 to $55 million in the bank today. At one point, we were the call center for the entire state of Nevada that handled contact tracing and vaccine support and those types of things. And it completely, while it wasn't insurance related at all, it completely aligned with how we operate in the communities that we serve. That was just one example. We go from that to, okay, this is going to end soon, Joey. What's your plan? And an immediate pivot around, we can be a third-party administrator. We're great at claims. Why wouldn't I offer those services publicly? So that was another pivot, right? So reinventing myself sort of has become the thing. And we've said that if you don't change, change will go after you and eventually eat you alive.
Yes.
And I've been able to be lucky enough to work for an organization that absolutely supports ideas like this and gives us the opportunity and the environment to play.
I love that, Joey. And maybe an added question is, it does take a certain mindset, I would say, to, take those leaps of faith in some cases or pivot. I mean, especially if you're jumping on a problem that's not, say, directly related to what you've been doing. So, that.
Yeah. There's two things that I think about when I open my mind up to things like this. And you will recognize the type of individual when I describe it to you. To me, there are two types of individuals in the world that you run into. One that will go right to why we can't.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 100 reasons why we can't. And frankly, a second grader can give me that. The other type of individual is, how can we?
Yes.
If you open your mind to the how can we question, that is what gets me motivated and challenged to do the next best thing. And once you develop your employees to be thinking along those lines in your teams, to me, it now becomes second nature, where they're like, all right, what are we doing next?
Yes.
And it gets them energized and motivated to do something different every day.
Love that. So then let's take the how can we and bring it into what's going on in insurance today.
Yeah.
So, insurance is a for-profit industry. It is. But where do you see money being left on the table and what can be done to address that?
It's a very unique time in the insurance industry. And while people that are not in the business believe that we are making hands over fists, that is simply not the case, right? So if you end with a combined ratio of 97, 98, 99, it's a great year, right? Everybody's celebrating. That just hasn't been the case lately.
Yes.
So in 2023, unfortunately, we had to pull out over $600 million from surplus that we ended up using for the business and running it. Loss was out of control. It still is, because inflation and other things like, not that this would ever happen, legal system abuse, those types of things, right? Especially with a mutual company, they say that when you start to die, it's a very slow death. And many times you don't feel it. So leaving money on the table, especially with expenses, drives me absolutely crazy.
Yes.
Now more than ever, as we've raised rates, I believe we can't continue to do that for our policyholders. And we are, or should be, the best stewards of their money. And in that regard, as we think about the next dollar that we spend, we got to make sure that that is absolutely the right thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. So then, thinking about the focus of this conversation and trust, how, where does trust fit into this equation? How is it impacted on the consumer side, but also, on the insurer side?
Yeah, I feel we're very fortunate. We're a member-based organization, so trust is there for the AAA brand.
Yes.
But in general, consumers are less trusting of the insurance company. Unfortunately, the plaintiff bar has done a very good job, in my opinion, with the advertising and the talking about how bad insurance companies are and how they lowball and sort of that sort of things. And I'm sure there are as well. However, we don't sit here and come up with a dollar amount to settle a claim that we pull out of the sky.
Right.
We are required by regulatory sort of issues that we've got to make sure that we offer in good faith. And the other side certainly doesn't have to do that. So we have to build back trust.
Yes.
You might ask, all right, how do we start, right? We've sort of fallen back year over year for at least 5 years that I know of, where the plaintiff bar has done a fabulous job sort of rallying together, sharing data, doing all of those things. While we sit here and talk about antitrust, we have to read antitrust language when insurance companies meet. I think we've just missed the mark. Let's maybe start with talking about how do we reduce rates? And that's not even a topic yet, because we are taking rates so rapidly right now that I think it's time to pause and say, how do we, when do we, right? So we've gotten really good at identifying, all right, we've got to raise rates here shortly. I think that language needs to permeate around how do we cut rates. Let's start there around building the trust back up.
Yes.
And being open and honest when we communicate with our policyholders.
And it's interesting, building the trust back up with consumers, there's also a need, I feel, for insurers to put some trust in their customers. And that can be challenging if you're in a situation where fraud is prevalent, for example. So how can you better trust consumers who you are working with when, in this case, you're kind of like, oh, got to check every single claim just to make sure. And that, has a negative impact on the experience.
Right. Yeah. And, for years, when I talk to a new hire class, everybody's all excited about the fraud component of it. And while fraud exists, it's important that as we develop our newer hires, they don't think about the fraud aspect, while they need to be sort of evaluating what they have in front of them. The advantage now is emerging technology.
Yes.
We are every vendor I talk to talks about AI. It almost seems like you can't all be doing AI, right? But that's sort of the sexy buzzword lately. Love the fact that we are starting to approach AI as a tool that'll help us evaluate our claims inventory 24/7 and giving you the next best action on every single claim. And if it's fraud, then it's fraud. If it's a buildup, which I'm seeing more and more around legal system abuse, while I don't like that, I also think that most of the time those claimants are victims themselves.
Yep.
when we have bad players actually doing surgery on claimants that were involved in an accident,
Mhm.
but may not need that surgery, they're victims. And while they collect some money, they collect money after everybody else and the claim gets paid.
Right.
You
Yep.
know, including the person that does transcriptions on depositions. They do it, without actually getting paid up front.
Yes.
Everything is contingent.
Yes.
Well, what happens to that claimant at the end when they end up with a bunch of medical bills and very little money that they settle their claim with?
Absolutely.
They too are victims.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, it's a great point, Joey. And Mindy from Mutual of Omaha said yesterday, insurers have to stop building solutions for insurers and build them for the customers or the claimant. And that's an example too, like where does the claimant fit in all of this? So to close this out, I want to go back to the how can we and ask you the big hairy question, if there is a big takeaway or something you would share with folks in the industry listening, things they should be thinking about or something they should do right now, what would that be?
Yeah, I think you said it earlier. I would start with building trust. I talked about the various ways we can do that.
Yeah.
That's how I would start. I would be careful about the money that's left on the table.
Yes.
I would communicate more openly with policyholders and explain the why.
Mm-hmm.
And very few carriers really think about that as being something they would lead with, but rather they would answer with once they get that question. And I would really think about the right cases to try. Let's take some of these cases to trial, especially when we feel that there's a network of bad players in the background that might be financing the case or what have you, right? It should no longer be around what is the win rate versus the offer rate. In certain cases where it's the right case, you might invest in that and start deposing bad actors and start to expose them. That is one way we start to build trust back up with the defendant who's your policyholder.
Excellent. Joey, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me again.